This is Todd Dean. We're here to talk about some very serious things that affect all of us. And that is addictions, depression, suicide, and mental health. This is part 2. Thank you for staying tuned. I just want to make sure that when you're on the treadmill, you can listen to the part 2 while you're working on the machines or whatever your other activity is. So, with that being said, we're talking about the solutions and the patterns and the issues that we have in our lives that affects all of us. So we started off talking with, which color are you feeling today? You're not feeling red, because that means serious, right? So here we go. We got our timeline. Age 3 years old, we established, is the foundation of who we are. Conversely, we talked about trauma. So trauma occurs as a child. And there's only 3 outlets that we talked about. And the 3 are addictions, depression, excuse me, not addictions, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself there. Addictions, mental health, and both. So we use the example of a little girl around codependency and being a people pleaser. Today we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about each one of these. So with that being said, when the event happens for the child, there has to be a coping mechanism for that. And so what children use is they actually start with addiction issues before the age of 3. And you're thinking, wait a second, Todd, you're trying to tell me that addictions start before the age of 3? The answer is yes. And here's how it works. When the trauma event occurs for the child, whether it's physical abuse, emotional, whatever the abuse or the trauma event that happens, as that child copes, they fill it with addictions. And guess what some of the addictions are for children that are under the age of 3? Being athletic, musical, smart, even bad, and many other areas that children use as coping mechanisms to offset the trauma in their lives. And if you don't believe me, Google Michael Phelps addiction. It's a classic example. So you have a child that has these coping mechanisms. So by the time they hit age 12 to 14 years old, and they get exposed to alcohol, sex, drugs, eating, and more, then the addictions are transferred from one to the other. So that's why if you go to, for example, AA, which is Dr. Bob, Bill W., fantastic job creating the 12 steps, but it's not going to solve and deal with the core issues, which is the childhood trauma. You have to deal with the trauma before you can break the patterns and the cycles. So getting back to the addictive patterns, we talked about this is how our lives look. Right? You like that squeakiness? That's exactly right. But here's the thing, as we have these trauma events in our lives, and then we use the addiction or the mental health as the coping mechanism to get the dopamines, and then we go to the lows, what happens is the quality of our life goes down. Just like that sound. So as you end up being 60, 70, 80, and hopefully 90, what happens is, if you go to a retirement home, in fact, I invite you, go to a retirement home and interview some of these folks this week. The reality is these people end up lonely, they're isolated, they're sad, they have shame and guilt, and they wonder where their lives went. This is the bulk of our population. Because we're not getting the answers we want. We're taught that if you read the books and go to seminars and do the work, you're going to change these patterns. It doesn't work like that. I wish it did. If the books had the answers, we'd have one book, and we'd probably all read it. Now, I know some of you are talking about the Bible, I'm sure, right now. And you know what? I'm all for that. So here's the deal. The question is, how do you break and deal with these patterns of addiction or mental health, both? So let's take, for example, any addiction is that if you look at 12 steps, just Google 12 steps AA, you're going to see a list of principles to live by. Okay, and Dr. Bob, Bill W. came up with these concepts with a number of others of principles of how to live life, which, listen to me, I'm a huge fan of. But oftentimes what I hear is someone will be in the, for example, AA meeting, and it's typically a man, unfortunately, but they're bragging, I got 30 years of sobriety, right? But they're not dealing with their anger addiction, or their gambling addiction, or their sex addiction. So even though they might be sober in alcohol, their quality of life is going to go down. So the first step, if you look at 12-step, is to recognize that we're powerless over our addiction. The word I look at is we do not have choice. We don't have the freedom of choice to break our codependency, our love addiction, our anger addiction, our sex addiction, our alcohol addiction, our gambling addiction, our eating addiction, or as a CEO, our work addiction, our working out addiction. It's not humanly possible to break those bonds. That's why suicide's on the incline, because it's humanly impossible to change the patterns within ourselves. We have to admit that our addiction has more power and control than we do. Now here's the deal. What's the second step? Second step in 12-step is to say, hey, I'm powerless over this. I need something greater than myself to break this pattern. Now here's the deal. I don't care what religion you are, but in this example, we're going to use God or higher power. So I don't care if it's Allah. I don't care if you're Hindu or Muslim or Jewish or Catholic. I don't care. Here's the deal. It takes something greater than us to break these patterns in our lives. Number 3 is education. So again, we talked about education. If the answers were in here, the answers would be in the books, which they are, but the answers in the books are not going to break the cycles. So you have to have education and structure. And then the fourth one is people. Okay? Now, that's easier said than done, right? It is, because it takes a lot of work. We're going to talk a little bit more about spirituality and the effects of that. We're also going to talk about technology and how the neural pathways work both. But hang on. Grab your Starbucks iced tea or whatever you have. Okay, so with that being said, the question is, what's the solution about breaking these patterns? Okay, so here's the deal. When I got into this work, I was fortunate. I had a counselor that said, hey, listen, Todd, are you serious about this? Are you serious about working on your stuff? And I said, of course I'm serious.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Could you please repeat what you said?
Siri, we don't want you right now. Stop.
Okay.
See, that's God right there. I'm telling you right there. Maybe God was saying to have another break. So anyways, we're talking about addictions, not SIRI. Okay, so with that being said, how do we break these patterns? Okay, so I'm going to oversimplify this, but we're going to get into this. Okay, so let's see here. So number 1 is that if you look at addictions and mental health, those are all coping mechanisms for the childhood trauma. Okay, so we have a go-to fight or flight reaction that when that trigger happens, no matter what it is, and we wonder why our relationships don't work or we date all these guys, well, the patterns are going to be the same. I had a very good friend of mine. I knew him before he got married. I knew him when he got married. I knew him when he got divorced. I knew him with his high school sweetheart. And he says, he said, Todd, I've got issues with this high school sweetheart. We reacquainted. We kind of got this on again, off again relationship. I said, listen, I go, your ex-wife and your high school sweetheart have the exact same patterns. He goes, what are you talking about? He goes, dude, he goes, there's no way that you're saying my ex-wife and my high school sweetheart have the same stuff going on. And I go, yeah. I go, so listen, I go, this isn't about them. This is about you. This is about your patterns. I said, you've got to work on your patterns because otherwise the next gal you meet is going to be the same as your high school sweetheart and your ex-wife. So he goes, I'm not buying it. No joke. Call me 3 months later. You know who you are. You're going to comment on this on my Facebook, aren't you? He calls me. He goes, you are so right. He goes, I can't say this word. He goes, you son of a gun. He goes, you're exactly right. I go, I know. He goes, how did you know that? I go, because an addiction is a square is a square is a square, just like a circle is a circle is a circle. So with the patterns of addictions with this little girl that's 6 months old that doesn't like arguments and doesn't like loud noises, she's going to get in these relationships of men that take advantage of her. And then she has her 20, 25-year marriage, and then she dates another guy and gets married to him for 5 years. That doesn't last. And she wonders, she's like, what is going on with all these men? The problem is she didn't have and understand what boundaries were, safe boundaries were as a child, because she never had those. So it's not an external problem, it's an internal problem. And what happens with my clients and when people go through this is when you break those patterns, what do you have? You have an entirely new life you've never had before. I've got one guy I've been working with for 2 years. He is angry and had these issues, and now you wouldn't know it's the same person. So the question is, how do you break these patterns? Okay, so here's the deal. We're gonna get a little spiritual, so hang on. So if you look at the Bible, okay, and I don't care what religion you are, but if you look at the NIV Christian Bible, okay, it talks in there about idolatry, okay, and specifically we're going to talk about Old Testament. So Old Testament, it's dark, it's heavy. You're not going to read Old Testament and say, hey honey, do you want to make love? It's just not going to happen. I'm going to tell you right now. It's not a fun material or fun section to read through. But here's the thing, is that if you look at Old Testament, if you were to sum it up, one of the things you could sum it up as is idolatry. And it's where these individuals and these communities were worshiping these idols. These idols. So, I do worship Starbucks, by the way. It's not Starbucks, it's the cups. Just saying. So anyways, they worship these idols, and what happened? We had the fires, the floods, the locusts. We had all this tremendous damage. But here's the thing. It says in the Bible, we have a jealous God. It says, and our God says, hey, you worship me and only me, or I'll bring helleth and fury in your life. Now here's the thing. That's the Christian and Jewish. Both believe in Old Testament. I'm not here to go into different religions, but here's the thing. I don't care what religion you are, with the exception of atheists. What's the common denominator amongst almost all religions? That's exactly right. That they believe in something greater than themselves. They believe in a higher power. They believe in a God, i.e. God or Allah or whatever. But here's the thing. We're going to use God in this case. What's the common denominator about one word that describes almost all religions? That's exactly right. Love. That's exactly right. The Beatles nailed it. They nailed it. All you need is love. That's exactly right. Now here's the thing. This is oversimplified, okay? And trust me, when I got into this, my counselor said, are you serious about taking this on? I said, yes. She goes, it's going to take you 3 to 5 years to get to first base. Are you still serious? I said, heck yeah, I'm going to knock this out in 3 to 6 months. Guess what? 5 years later, she was right. So this is not an easy equation to answer right away, but here's the thing, is idolatry, which is Old Testament, if you look at our life and you look at the mental health issues, autism, OCD, ADD, alcoholism, sex addiction, gambling addiction, whatever it is, overeating, if you look at it, what are we worshiping when we get triggered? When our husband doesn't take out the trash, what are we worshiping? We get angry, and we're going to medicate, and we're going to go to the opiates. We're going to go to the alcohol. We're going to go to, a game. That's the medication. And here's the thing, with addictions, your quality of life goes down. And it says in 12-step, for example, hey, your powerlessness, but when you give up that addiction, not give up, when you say mercy to that addiction, you say, hey, God, whatever, I can't do this. How do I get out of this? Here's the most amazing thing about this. And if you don't believe me, try this. When you give up your powerlessness and say mercy to something greater, what are you saying mercy to? That's exactly right. You're saying mercy to God or your higher power, who represents love. And if you know anything about mental health and addictions both, what happens when someone's sober? Good things happen in their lives. Why? Because you're allowing love to come into your life. So here's the crazy thing. Addictions represent idolatry. And so when we're worshiping when we're worshiping alcohol or opiates, depression, whatever it is, we're taken away from love. And I know this goes out to many of you. I had a couple messages yesterday, one from a woman I've worked with. She said, Todd, I'm depressed. We always want to go inward instead of outward when we're dealing with our addictions. So here's what I invite you to. So number one, feel free to reach out to me. My email is todd@todddean.com. You can go to Sanjara website. I am on social media on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn under Todd Dean. And feel free to connect or message me. There are solutions. Okay, so with that being said, when we break these cycles of addictions, we allow love in, which creates miracles. But more importantly, you're creating peace of mind. So instead of living this life that many of us do, you get to live a life where you're much happier and you're much more at peace. So I'll just sum it up with, I didn't go into the technologies that we use. I didn't go into the Eastern philosophies we use. I didn't go into the exact trauma work, how we work with it. But this is an overview of changing the issues in your lives. So if you do want to know more information, feel free to reach out. And here's the thing. At the end of the day, you are worth living, and we want you to live. We want you to be the best you that you can be, because here's the deal. You're a gift to each one of us. So I hope that was helpful. Hope you learned a couple things. Thank you, my higher power, for the right words and for spelling love correctly and trauma correctly. And with that, Todd Dean, over and out.